Maduro is in New York. The airstrikes are over. The press conferences are done. But the real story is just beginning. What happened in Venezuela is not a courtroom story. It is a systems story. This analysis steps away from the spectacle and looks at what actually happened, not through personalities or politics, but through structure. It traces how an operation framed as law enforcement sits inside a much larger strategy involving resources, trade routes, and the control of economic systems that shape global power. For years, pressure was applied quietly. Sanctions hardened. Financial channels narrowed. Energy markets shifted. China's economic footprint expanded across South America. Venezuela did not suddenly become important. It became unavoidable. What appears abrupt is the final move in a long sequence, where negotiation gave way to force and market logic replaced diplomacy. This report examines why this happened now, not earlier. Why oil denomination, currency systems, and China's role in the hemisphere sit at the center of the decision, even when official explanations keep changing. And why the contradictions between public statements reveal more than the statements themselves. Right now, across every news network, you're watching the same story on repeat. Special forces descending from the sky, a Latin American president in handcuffs, commentators praising tactical precision and strategic brilliance. They want you focused on the spectacle, on the daring raid, on the military success. Because if you're watching the helicopters, you're not watching the balance sheet. This wasn't regime change for democracy. This wasn't about human rights violations or drug cartels. This was a debt collection operation with gunships. There's an old rule in geopolitics that everyone pretends doesn't exist. You cannot sanction the countries that control your vital resources. Not forever, not without consequences. For 23 years, the United States tried to defy this rule. They sanctioned Venezuela. They froze assets. They recognized parallel governments. They funded opposition movements. They did everything except the one thing they just did. Until this week, when all of that collapsed in the most revealing way possible. On December 28th, Nicolas Maduro signed energy agreements with China worth $18 billion. 2 days later, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, quietly requested a meeting with Venezuelan officials in Panama, not to threaten, not to impose conditions, to negotiate access to oil that Washington has spent 2 decades trying to destroy. What you're witnessing is not diplomacy. It's capitulation that got interrupted by helicopters. The media has been selling you a story for years. They told you the shale revolution made America energy independent. They told you the United States is now the world's largest oil producer and therefore doesn't need to care about the Middle East or Latin America anymore. This is a half-truth. And in geopolitics, a half-truth is a full lie. The United States does produce massive amounts of oil, but it produces light, sweet crude. It's like champagne. Bubbly, light, expensive to extract, and not what American refineries were built to process. The problem is this. The massive refineries in Texas and Louisiana, the industrial backbone of American energy, were built 50 years ago. They were designed to process heavy, sour crude, the thick, sludge-like oil that comes from Venezuela and the Middle East. America produces champagne, but its engines run on diesel. For decades, they solved this by importing heavy crude from Saudi Arabia. But that relationship is effectively dead. Saudi Arabia is no longer the gas station of the West. Riyadh is cutting production to keep prices high. They're joining BRICS. They're ignoring calls from Washington. The Saudi prince has made it very clear he's no longer interested in being a vassal state. So the United States faced a mathematical problem. They were running out of the specific type of oil needed to keep their refineries running at capacity. And worse, they had already played their emergency card. Over the last 2 years, the administration drained the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The SPR is meant for war. It's meant for national emergencies. It is not meant to buy votes by artificially lowering gas prices before elections. Yet they opened the taps. They flooded the market with millions of barrels to keep prices down. Now the bill has come due. The SPR is at its lowest level since 1983, 351 million barrels. That's it. Under the Biden administration, 180 million barrels were released in 2022 alone to control prices after the Ukraine conflict started. Those barrels have not been replaced. The International Energy Agency projects a deficit of 1.2 million barrels daily for 2025 if tensions with Iran escalate and Russian sanctions remain in place. So Washington looked at the map. They looked for heavy crude suppliers. Canada is already pumping at maximum capacity. Russia is sanctioned and hostile. Saudi Arabia is uncooperative and pivoting toward Beijing. That left only one option: the massive heavy crude fields of the Orinoco Belt, Venezuela. This is what this is really about. Not oil volume, but oil denomination. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, roughly 300 billion barrels, but production has collapsed. Under Maduro, output fell from over 3 million barrels per day to less than 1 million. Infrastructure decayed, investments stopped, skilled workers fled. So if Venezuela isn't producing much oil, why does it matter strategically? Because it's not about current production, it's about future control. For 50 years, global oil has been priced in US dollars. This system, called the petrodollar, creates automatic demand for American currency. Every country that needs oil needs dollars to buy it. That demand allows the United States to borrow cheaply, print money without immediate inflation consequences, and finance its debt at lower interest rates than economic fundamentals would otherwise allow. But that system is fracturing. Saudi Arabia refused to renew its exclusive dollar agreement. BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are increasingly settling energy trades in local currencies or yuan. And Venezuela, according to multiple reports, was preparing to fully integrate its energy sector into China's cross-border interbank payment system and price its oil in a basket of currencies led by the yuan. If that had happened, China could buy Venezuelan oil without holding dollars. If China doesn't need to hold dollars, demand for US currency drops. If demand drops, the dollar's value falls. If the dollar falls, the cost of servicing American debt skyrockets. This is the threat. Not that Venezuela would sell 1 million barrels a day to China, but that Venezuela sitting on 300 billion barrels would prove you can price oil outside the dollar system and survive. That's what Washington couldn't allow. The American dollar is not backed by gold. It hasn't been since 1971. It's not backed by industrial productivity. The manufacturing base has been hollowed out for decades. It's backed by one thing: an agreement made 50 years ago with Saudi Arabia. Oil must be sold in dollars. This is the magic trick. Because every nation on Earth needs oil, every nation needs dollars to buy it. This creates permanent artificial demand for US currency. It allows the United States to print trillions of dollars, export the inflation to the rest of the world, and never face the consequences. This system is called the exorbitant privilege. It's the source of American prosperity for half a century. But recently, the magic started to fade. In June 2024, the Saudi-American petrodollar agreement formally expired. Saudi Arabia did not renew it. They now accept Chinese yuan for oil sales to China, their largest customer. In November 2024, the United Arab Emirates processed $128 billion in bilateral trade with China completely in yuan. Russia sells oil to India in rupees and rubles. Iran sells to China in yuan. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves fell from 71% in 1999 to 58% in 2024. Each percentage point of decline represents approximately $350 billion in reduced demand for U.S. Treasury bonds. Here's what most coverage is missing. Venezuela didn't happen in isolation. It's one move in a continental economic contest that's been building for 2 decades. China-Latin America trade hit $518 billion in 2024. That's not a typo. Over $500 billion, and it's growing at roughly 30% annually. 20 years ago, China accounted for less than 2% of Latin America's exports. Today, China is South America's largest trading partner. Brazil trades more with China than with the United States. So does Peru. So does Chile. Ecuador just signed a free trade agreement with Beijing in 2024. Nicaragua did the same. 22 out of 33 Latin American and Caribbean nations have joined China's Belt and Road Initiative. This isn't just trade statistics. This is infrastructure. China now owns or operates major ports in Peru, Brazil, Panama, and Ecuador. The port of Changsei in Peru, which just opened, is designed to handle exports from 6 South American countries directly to Asia, cutting the United States out of the supply chain entirely. So when you hear about Venezuela, understand the context. The United States is watching its historical sphere of influence shift economically toward Beijing. And that shift isn't abstract. It's ports, railroads, energy contracts, and payment systems. Venezuela currently produces 780,000 barrels daily. Under Chinese technical management and Russian financial support, that production could reach 1.4 million barrels daily within 18 months. But here's the problem that triggered this entire operation. That oil is already committed. China signed oil prepayment contracts with Venezuela worth $62 billion between 2007 and 2024. Russia provided another $17 billion in credit lines backed by crude shipments. The United States tried 4 strategies to break this encirclement. Every single one failed. The first strategy was maximum pressure through sanctions. It failed because Venezuela developed export networks completely outside the SWIFT banking system, ships with flags of convenience, payments in yuan, refineries in Malaysia. Washington discovered that sanctioning paper doesn't stop oil molecules from moving. The second strategy was regime change through proxies. They spent millions backing Juan Guaido, recognizing him as the legitimate president, even though he never controlled a single military barracks. By 2023, even the Venezuelan opposition had abandoned him. American recognition became an international joke. The third strategy was diplomatic isolation. It failed because 134 countries never recognized Guaido. Latin America, including Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, restored full diplomatic relations with Caracas between 2022 and 2024, completely ignoring Washington's objections. The fourth strategy was conditional licenses, allowing companies like Chevron limited permission to operate in Venezuela, but with strings attached. This is failing right now because Maduro learned the fundamental lesson. Never trust American concessions designed as control levers, and then came the final trigger. Intelligence reports that mainstream media is conveniently ignoring suggested that Caracas was preparing what financial analysts were calling a nuclear option. Venezuela was on the verge of officially integrating its energy sector into China's cross-border interbank payment system CIPS. They were preparing to price their entire reserve, the largest on Earth, not in dollars, but in a basket of currencies led by the yuan and backed by gold. If this had happened, it would have been a signal to the entire global South. It would have proven that you can possess massive resource wealth outside the American banking system and survive. Washington saw this as an existential threat. So Washington had a choice: accept the new multipolar reality and negotiate as an equal partner, or use the one asset they still have in abundance, military force. They chose the gun. The operation itself was, from a purely tactical standpoint, extraordinary. Delta Force operatives extracted Maduro from his residence. No American casualties. Maduro is now on a U.S. warship heading to New York to face a sealed indictment that's been waiting since 2020. Trump at the press conference couldn't contain himself. He said, "You're probably never going to get to see what I saw last night. It was amazing. These guys were moving so fast. He was watching it in real time from Mar-a-Lago like it was a reality TV show, which in his mind it was." But here's where the spectacle ends and the consequences begin. Trump and Marco Rubio were asked repeatedly at the press conference, who's going to run Venezuela now? How long will American forces be there? What's the plan for governance? And they had no answer. Trump did say that American oil companies will go in and help Venezuela rebuild its energy sector. He was very explicit about this. He said it's pathetic how much they've been producing given their reserves, and American companies will fix that. He said the oil would go to other countries and to the United States as reimbursement for damages. Rubio walked it back the next day, said the US doesn't need Venezuelan oil, said this is about governance, not resources. But the contradiction tells you everything. Trump says what the operation is about. Rubio manages the diplomatic fallout. Venezuela is not Panama. This is not 1989 when George H.W. Bush sent forces in to remove General Noriega. Panama had 3 million people. Venezuela has 30 million. Panama had a massive American military base in the strategically vital Panama Canal. Venezuela has neither. More importantly, Maduro was not a personalist dictator. This wasn't like removing Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi, where the entire state structure revolved around one individual. Maduro rose within a system, the Chavista system, a network of generals, intelligence chiefs, judiciary officials, and paramilitary groups called collectivos.